The neon red light of the Broken Spoke Saloon buzzed with the rhythmic hum of a Texas summer night, creating a halo of nostalgia against the darkened Austin sky. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of sawdust stale beer and the kind of honest sweat that comes from two-stepping until your boots wear thin. George Strait sat in the corner of his pickup truck in the parking lot for a moment, watching that sign flicker. He loved places like this, places where the wood was warped by time, and the stories were etched into the bar top like scars. But tonight he was not there to sing nor to drink. He was merely passing through a ghost of the past on his way to a world that felt increasingly alien to him. He adjusted the brim of his resistal hat, looking at his reflection in the rearview mirror. The lines around his eyes were deeper now, maps of a life spent on the road and on the ranch. He had just come from checking a herd of cattle at a friend's property nearby, and his boots were caked in dry mud, his denim shirt stained with the honest dirt of hard labor. He looked less like the king of country, and more like a man who had spent the last 12 hours fixing fences under a blistering sun. His stomach growled a low rumble that reminded him he hadn't eaten since dawn. He put the truck in gear and pulled away from the comforting grit of the Broken Spoke, heading toward the north side of town, where the air grew thinner and the gates grew taller. He was headed to the Verde Horizon Golf and Country Club, not because he wanted to, but because he had a meeting with a land developer who insisted on meeting there. George didn't care for fancy tablecloths or menus he couldn't pronounce, but he was a man of his word, and he was hungry. Miles away from the dusty charm of the honky-tonks, the Verde Horizon Golf and Country Club stood like a fortress of exclusion. The grass was a shade of green that did not exist in nature, manicured by an army of silent workers who vanished before the first member teed off. The air conditioning inside the main restaurant was set to a temperature that chilled the bone, designed to keep the clientele comfortable in their Italian wool blazers. It was a place where the silence was heavy, broken only by the polite clinking of silver against fine china and the hushed gossip of the local elite. In the center of this cold perfection moved Norma. At 62 years old, Norma was the invisible engine that kept the dining room running. She moved with a slight limp, a souvenir from 40 years of waiting tables on concrete floors, but her face remained a mask of professional warmth. Her uniform was pressed to military standards, though the fabric was thinning at the elbows. Norma was a woman who carried the weight of the world on shoulders that seemed too fragile to bear it. Her husband, a good man who had worked the oil fields, had passed away 3 years ago, leaving behind nothing but memories and a mountain of medical debt that grew like a cancer with interest rates that kept Norma awake until the sun came up. That morning before her shift, Norma had opened her locker in the staff changing room and stared at the envelope that had been burning a hole in her purse. It was a final notice from the electric company. If she didn't pay $300 by Friday, the lights in her small apartment would go out. She had closed her eyes for a moment, praying to a God she hoped was still listening, asking for strength, asking for a miracle, or just enough tips to keep the darkness at bay. She had wiped a solitary tear from her cheek, applied a fresh coat of lipstick, and stepped out onto the floor ready to serve people who spent more on a bottle of wine than she earned in a month. But the atmosphere at Verde Horizon had changed recently. The old manager, Mr. Henderson, who had hired Norma and treated the staff like family, had retired. In his place came Julian. Julian was 28 years old, with a smile that never reached his eyes and a suit that cost more than Norma's car. He had been brought in by the board of directors to modernize the club to attract a younger, hipper crowd. To Julian, modernization meant erasing anything that looked old or tired. And every time he looked at Norma, he didn't see a loyal employee with decades of experience. He saw an antique that needed to be discarded. Julian stood by the hostess stand, tapping away on a tablet, his eyes scanning the dining room like a predator looking for weakness. He hated the way Norma walked. He hated the way she called the customers honey or darling, even though the older members loved it. He wanted sleek, he wanted young. He wanted models carrying trays, not grandmothers. He had already fired the head chef for refusing to put avocado toast on the dinner menu, and everyone knew Norma was next. The tension in the air was palpable. The younger waitstaff walked on eggshells, terrified of making eye mistake. Norma just kept her head down, pouring water, folding napkins, making sure the bread baskets were warm. She knew Julian was watching her. She could feel his gaze on her back like a laser pointer. She needed this job. She needed it more than she needed air. The heavy oak doors of the restaurant swung open, and the midday heat rushed in for a brief second, before the climate controls swallowed it whole. George Strait walked in. He didn't stride in like a celebrity. He walked in like a tired cowboy looking for a glass of tea and a steak. The dust on his boots left faint prints on the polished marble floor. His jeans were faded, almost white at the knees, and his shirt had a tear near the pocket where a barbed wire fence had snagged him earlier that day. He took off his hat out of habit, holding it against his chest, revealing hair that was silver and perfectly swept back, though slightly messy from the wind. He stood at the entrance, waiting to be seated. The hostess, a young girl named Tiffany, looked up from her podium and froze. She didn't recognize him. To her, he was just a dirty old man who had wandered into the wrong establishment. She looked nervously at Julian. Julian looked up from his tablet, and his lip curled in immediate disgust. He didn't see the king of country. He didn't see the man who had sold more records than almost anyone in history. He saw a liability. He saw dirt. He saw someone who didn't fit the aesthetic he was trying to curate for the Verde horizon. Julian walked over to the podium, stepping in front of Tiffany, his cologne overpowering the scent of fresh lilies in the vase. He looked George up and down, making a show of inspecting his dusty boots. "Can I help you, Sir?" Julian asked, his voice dripping with that specific kind of politeness that is actually an insult. His tone suggested that George was lost, perhaps looking for a gas station or a feed store. George smiled a genuine, easy smile that had charmed millions, but today it only seemed to annoy Julian further. "Just looking for a table for one." George said, his voice low and steady, the famous Texas drawl thick and warm. "I have a meeting in about an hour, but I'd like to eat something first if you have the room." Julian looked around the half-empty restaurant. There were dozens of empty tables, but Julian shook his head slightly as if doing complex calculus in his mind. "We are expecting a very high-profile group shortly," Julian lied smoothly. "We are at capacity for walk-ins, especially those who do not meet our dress code." He gestured vaguely at George's attire. "The club has a strict policy regarding workwear, sir. We prefer business casual." George looked down at his shirt and chuckled softly. "I suppose I am a bit dusty. Cows don't care much for dress codes. Look, son, I'll sit in the back corner. I won't bother anyone. I just need a steak and some iced tea. I'll be out of your hair before your VIPs arrive." Julian hesitated. He wanted to kick the man out. But there was something about George's demeanor, something unshakable, that made Julian pause. He didn't want a scene. "Fine," Julian snapped. He grabbed a menu and walked briskly toward the darkest, most obscured table in the back, near the swinging kitchen doors. He didn't wait for George to follow. He just walked, expecting obedience. George followed, his boots clicking softly on the floor. He sat in the small table, which was wobbly and right under a ventilation vent that blew freezing air directly onto his neck. Julian dropped the menu on the table without opening it. "Someone will be with you eventually," Julian said, emphasizing the word eventually, "but do not expect quick service. We prioritize our members." With that, he turned on his heel and marched back to the front of the house, leaving the living legend sitting alone in the shadows. Norma had watched the entire exchange from the service station. Her heart ached. She had been raised to believe that hospitality was a sacred duty, that you treated a pauper with the same respect as a prince. She saw a tired man who was hungry, and she saw a bully treating him like trash. She started to move toward table 4, toward George, but Julian intercepted her. He grabbed her arm, his grip tight and painful. "Don't you dare," Julian hissed, leaning close to her ear so the diners wouldn't hear. "Do not go to that table, Norma. That man is a waste of time. He probably can't even afford the water. I have the influencers from the Tex Glam Collective arriving in 5 minutes. They are going to be seated in the center atrium. I want you on them. Only them. If I see you wasting time with the cowboy, you are finished. Do you understand me?" Norma looked at Julian's cold eyes. She thought of the electric bill in her locker. She thought of the dark apartment. She swallowed her pride and nodded. "Yes, sir," she whispered. "Good," Julian said, releasing her arm. "Go check the silverware at the center table. I want it spotless." Norma walked away, her heart heavy. She glanced back at table 4. George was sitting there, patiently reading the menu, holding it up to catch the dim light. He looked thirsty. 10 minutes passed, then 20. No one went to George. The other waiters, young and terrified of Julian, walked past table 4 with their eyes fixed on the floor, ignoring the man in the corner as if he were a ghost. George didn't complain. He didn't wave his arms. He simply waited, observing. He watched the way the staff moved in fear. He watched Julian preening by the door. He saw the culture of the place, and it saddened him. This wasn't the Texas he knew. This was something plastic and hollow. Finally, the doors burst open, and the noise level in the restaurant skyrocketed. The VIPs had arrived. It was a group of 6 young men and women, loud, beautiful, and completely self-absorbed. They were streaming live from their phones, holding selfie sticks and laughing raucously. They were dressed in designer clothes that looked like costumes meant to mimic country style without any of the substance. Pristine cowboy hats that had never seen rain boots, that had never touched mud. Julian transformed instantly. His sneer was replaced by a fawning, obsequious smile. "Welcome, welcome," he boomed, clapping his hands. "We have the best table ready for you." The group ignored him, mostly talking to their phone screens. "Hey guys, we are at Verde Horizon," shouted one of the girls into her phone, pouting her lips. "It's so bougie, we love it." They swept into the center of the room, treating the restaurant like their personal stage. Julian snapped his fingers at Norma. "Champagne, now, the expensive stuff." Norma hurried to the cellar, her leg throbbing. She brought the heavy bucket of ice and crystal flutes. She poured the champagne, her hands trembling slightly from fatigue. One of the young men, a boy with bleached hair and sunglasses indoors, bumped into her arm as he turned to high-five his friend. A small splash of champagne landed on the tablecloth. "Watch it, Grandma," the boy snapped, not even looking at her. "You almost ruined my Gucci jacket." Norma paled. "I am so sorry, sir," she stammered, reaching for a napkin to dab the cloth. "Just get away," the boy said, waving her off like a fly. "Julian, bring us someone who doesn't have the shakes, okay?" Julian was there in a second, placing a hand on the boy's shoulder. "My deepest apologies." "Norma, step away. Go to the kitchen. Now." Norma felt the humiliation burn her cheeks. She retreated to the service station, holding back tears. She looked across the room. The contrast was brutal. In the center, the loud, ungrateful group was being showered with attention and alcohol. In the corner, George Strait sat alone, still waiting for a glass of water. He was watching her. He had seen the boy yell at her. He had seen Julian dismiss her. And for the first time since he entered the restaurant, the calm expression on George's face shifted. A shadow crossed his eyes. He wasn't angry for himself. He could handle hunger. He could handle rudeness, but he could not abide seeing a lady treated with such cruelty. Norma stood by the coffee machine, trying to compose herself. She looked at the clock. It had been 35 minutes since the man in the corner had sat down. He hadn't been served a single thing, not even water. It was inhumane. It went against everything she believed in. She looked at the center table where Julian was laughing at a joke he clearly didn't understand, just to please the rich kids. He wasn't watching her. This was her chance. Norma made a decision. It was a dangerous decision. It was a decision that could cost her the $300 she needed for the lights. But she looked at her hands, calloused and wrinkled, and she remembered who she was. She was a woman of Texas. She was a mother. She was a worker. And she would not let a guest go thirsty in her house. She grabbed a pitcher of ice-cold tea, the house specialty brewed with mint and lemon. She grabbed a basket of fresh, warm sourdough bread and the whipped honey butter. She didn't look at Julian. She moved with a speed that defied her aching hip. She navigated the perimeter of the room, staying in the shadows, until she reached table 4. When she arrived, she placed the bread down gently and poured the tea into a tall glass. The ice cracked satisfyingly. "Here you go, sugar," she said, her voice soft and kind. "I'm so sorry for the wait. It's been a chaotic afternoon." George looked up at her. Up close, she saw the kindness in his blue eyes. He didn't look at her uniform or her age. He looked at her soul. "Thank you, Mom," George said, tipping his imaginary hat. "I was about to start eating the napkins." Norma chuckled, a genuine sound that felt out of place in the sterile room. "We can't have that. The steak is good today, but the catfish is better, fresh from the coast. I'd recommend it fried with the okra." "I'll take the catfish then," George said, handing her the menu. "And keep the tea coming. It's hot out there." Norma smiled, feeling a warmth she hadn't felt in months. It was the connection of two real people in a room full of fakes. "You got it," she said. She turned to head back to the kitchen, feeling a small victory. But as she turned, she saw him. Julian was standing at the entrance to the kitchen, arms crossed, face purple with rage. He had seen everything. He had seen her pouring the tea. He had seen her smiling. He motioned for her to come to him with a sharp jerk of his head. Norma's heart hammered against her ribs. The walk to the kitchen felt like walking to the gallows. She passed the influencer table where they were now spraying champagne on each other, laughing hysterically, while other diners looked on in annoyance. Julian didn't care about their behavior. He only cared about Norma's disobedience. She pushed through the swinging doors into the noise and heat of the kitchen. Julian followed her, and the doors swung shut, cutting off the sound of the dining room. He didn't shout. His voice was a low, venomous whisper which was somehow worse. "I gave you a direct order," he said, stepping into her personal space. "I told you to ignore him. I told you to focus on the VIPs, and you decided to play the hero." Norma stood tall, clutching her serving tray. "He was thirsty, Mr. Julian. It's 95 degrees outside. I couldn't just let him sit there. It's not right." "Not right?" Julian laughed, a dry, humorless sound. "You know what's not right, Norma. An employee who thinks she runs the place. You are slow, you are old, and now you are insubordinate. I have been looking for a reason to cut the dead weight from this staff, and you just handed it to me on a silver platter." Norma felt the blood drain from her face. "Please," she whispered. "I need this job. I have bills. I'll do whatever you want. Just don't fire me. Not today." Julian smirked, enjoying the power. He reached out and tugged at the apron tied around her waist. "It's too late for begging. Take it off. You're done. Clock out. Get your things and get out of my building. And don't you dare go back out on that floor to say goodbye to anyone. If you are not off the property in 10 minutes, I will call security and have you escorted out for trespassing." Norma stood frozen. The kitchen staff, the cooks and dishwashers who loved her, kept their heads down, scrubbing pans and chopping vegetables, too afraid to intervene. They knew Julian would fire them too. Norma's hands shook as she untied her apron. The knot was tight, but she managed to loosen it. She folded it neatly, because that's who she was, and placed it on the stainless steel counter. She turned to leave, her eyes blurring with tears, but then she stopped. She remembered the man at table 4. He was waiting for his catfish. He was waiting for his refill. She couldn't leave him like that. Not without an explanation, not without dignity. She reached into her pocket and pulled out her order pad. With a trembling hand, she wrote a note. It wasn't long. It was honest. She tore the page out. She looked at Julian, who was already typing on his phone, ignoring her. Norma slipped out the back service door, but instead of going to the locker room, she circled around to the side entrance of the dining room. She had one last table to clear. She walked over to George one last time. He was sipping his tea, enjoying the silence of his corner. He saw her approach and saw the red rimming her eyes. He saw the absence of her apron. "Is everything all right?" George asked, putting his glass down. His voice was sharp with concern. Norma forced a smile that broke 1,000 hearts. "Just a bit of dust in the air, sir," she lied. "My shift is over. Someone else will bring your food. I just wanted to drop off the bill for the tea. I didn't want you to have to wait for it later." She placed the small slip of paper on the table, face down. It wasn't a bill. It was her message. George frowned. He knew something was wrong. A woman doesn't lose her apron and cry over dust in the middle of a shift. "Thank you, Norma," he said, reading her name tag before she could turn away. "You're a good woman." Norma choked back a sob. "God bless you, sir. Enjoy your meal." And with that, she turned and walked away, not toward the kitchen, but toward the front door, past the laughing influencers, past the sneering Julian, and out into the blinding Texas heat. George watched her go. He watched the way her shoulders slumped. He looked at the paper on the table. He picked it up. His calloused thumb brushed over the trembling handwriting. He began to read, and as he read, the air in the corner of the room seemed to change. The temperature dropped not from the AC, but from the cold, hard resolve forming in the heart of the king of country. The noise of the influencers faded into background static. All George could see were the words on the paper and the injustice they represented. He wasn't hungry anymore. He was ready to work. But this time the work wasn't roping steers. It was teaching a lesson. The paper in George Straight's hand was cheap, thin thermal receipt paper, the kind that turns black if you leave it in the sun too long. But the words, written in blue ballpoint ink, carried the weight of a granite tombstone. He read it once. Then he read it again. His eyes, which had seen the lights of the Astrodome and the endless horizons of the Texas brush country, narrowed into slits of focused intensity. The note was shaky, the handwriting of a woman who had been trembling when she wrote it. "Sir, I apologize if the service was slow. The manager forbade me from serving you because of your clothes, but I could not leave a gentleman thirsty. I was fired for this, but it was worth it to do what is right. God bless. Norma." George placed the note gently on the white tablecloth, smoothing out the creases with a hand that had roped steers and strummed guitars for 5 decades. He took a deep breath, inhaling the scent of the restaurant, truffle oil, expensive perfume, and underneath it all the rotting stench of arrogance. He looked at the glass of iced tea Norma had poured for him. Condensation was beading on the outside, rolling down onto the linen. It was the only honest thing on the table. He took a long, slow sip. The tea was cold, sweet, and perfect. It tasted like dignity. It tasted like a sacrifice. Outside the heavy glass doors, the Texas sun was waging a war against the asphalt. Norma stood at the edge of the curb, her small purse clutched tight against her chest, as if it contained the last fragments of her life. The heat was oppressive, a physical weight that pressed down on her shoulders, instantly making her uniform stick to her back. She felt dizzy. The shock of what had just happened was beginning to wear off, replaced by a cold, creeping panic that started in her stomach and spread to her fingertips. She had no job. She had $300 due by Friday. She had a mortgage that was 2 months behind. She looked down at her shoes, the rubber soles worn thin on one side, to accommodate her limp. She walked slowly toward the bus stop, a lonely metal bench sitting under a pathetic mesquite tree that offered no real shade. Every step sent a jolt of pain through her hip, but the physical pain was nothing compared to the shame burning in her chest. She had been discarded, thrown out like a broken plate. She sat on the hot metal bench and let her head fall into her hands. She didn't cry out loud. She was too proud for that. But silent tears, hot and salty, tracked through the powder on her cheeks, dripping onto her hands. She whispered to the empty air, speaking to the husband who had been gone for 3 years. "Oh, Bill, I don't know what to do. I tried to be good. I tried to do it right. But they just don't care." Back inside the Verde horizon, the atmosphere was shifting, though most of the patrons were too self-absorbed to notice. The group of influencers in the center of the room had reached a fever pitch of volume. They were now standing up, posing for a group photo with a bottle of Dom Perignon, holding the glasses high, while Julian hovered around them like a moth drawn to a flame. Julian was beaming. This was his vision coming to life. Young, rich, beautiful people tagging the location on social media. This was the future. He had forgotten about Norma the moment she walked out the door. She was just a line item, a problem solved. He had forgotten about the cowboy in the corner too, assuming the old man would eat his bread and leave quietly. But the old man wasn't eating, and he wasn't leaving. George Strait pushed his chair back. The legs of the heavy wooden chair scraped against the marble floor. It was a harsh grating sound that cut through the ambient jazz music and the influencers' laughter like a gunshot. It wasn't loud enough to stop the whole room, but it was loud enough to make the people at the nearest tables turn their heads. They saw a man standing up. He wasn't rushing. He adjusted his belt buckle, a large silver piece engraved with the silhouette of a bucking horse. He picked up his hat, the dusty resistol, and placed it on his head, pulling the brim down low just above his eyes. He didn't look like a customer anymore. He looked like a sheriff from a time when the law was written in lead. He picked up the note. He picked up the wad of cash he kept in his front pocket, a habit from the old days when credit cards were useless in small towns. He began to walk. The distance from the dark corner table to the center of the room was perhaps 50 feet, but the way George walked it felt like a procession. His boots had a distinct heavy cadence. Thud, click, thud, click. The sound of a man who knows exactly where he is going and exactly what he is going to do when he gets there. He walked past a table of bankers who were discussing oil futures. They stopped talking as he passed, sensing a shift in the air pressure. He walked past a couple on a first date. The woman looked up, her eyes widening, not because she recognized him yet, but because his presence was so commanding it demanded attention. Julian was busy pouring more champagne for the girl with the pink hair when he felt a shadow fall over him. He turned around, his smile ready, but it froze when he saw the dusty cowboy standing 3 feet away. Julian's first instinct was annoyance. Why was this peasant out of his corner? Why was he interrupting the VIP experience? "Can I help you?" Julian asked, his voice dripping with condescension. "The restrooms are in the lobby if that's what you're looking for. Or perhaps you're lost again." George didn't answer immediately. He just looked at Julian. He looked at the tailored suit, the manicured fingernails, the sneer that seemed permanently etched onto the young man's face. George took off his sunglasses, slowly revealing those piercing blue eyes that had stared down millions of fans, but now held the cold fury of a Texas winter storm. "I'm not lost, son," George said. His voice was quiet, but it carried a resonance that made the glasses on the table vibrate. "But I think you are. You're about as lost as a calf in a snowstorm." The influencers, sensing drama, lowered their phones. The girl with the pink hair turned her camera toward George. She didn't know who he was. Country music wasn't her vibe, but she knew content when she saw it. A confrontation, an old boomer versus a manager. This was viral gold. She hit record. Julian laughed, a nervous, high-pitched sound. "Excuse me? Sir, I am going to have to ask you to lower your voice or I will have you removed. You are disturbing our premium guests." George ignored the threat. He held up the small, crumpled piece of paper. "This is from Norma," he said. Julian rolled his eyes. "Oh God. Did she beg you for money?" "I knew it. She's pathetic. I'll have security check her bag before she leaves the property." George took a step closer. Julian instinctively took a step back, bumping into the champagne bucket. The ice rattled. "She didn't ask for a dime," George said, his voice dropping an octave, becoming harder. "She apologized. She apologized for your behavior. She apologized because you wouldn't let her serve a man water, because his boots had mud on them. She told me you fired her for bringing me a glass of tea." Julian straightened his jacket, trying to regain his composure in front of the cameras. She was fired for insubordination. She disobeyed a direct order. And frankly, she didn't fit the image of the Verde Horizon. "We are a world-class establishment. We have standards." "Standards," George repeated the word, tasting it like sour milk. "You think standards are about expensive wine and fancy suits? You think class is something you can buy with a membership fee?" George looked around the room. The entire restaurant had gone silent. The bankers, the couples, the waiters, everyone was watching. "Let me tell you something about standards, son." George continued, his eyes never leaving Julian's face. "I've played in dive bars, where the floor was sticky with beer, and I've played in the White House for presidents. I've met kings and I've met paupers. And the only difference between a man of class and a piece of trash is how he treats the person who serves him his dinner." The girl with the pink hair gasped softly. Her camera was zoomed in on George's face. The comments on her live stream started to scroll frantically. "Wait, is that OMG? That sounds like him. Look at the jawline. Is that George Strait?" Julian flushed red. "Listen, old man, I don't know who you think you are, coming in here and lecturing me on how to run my business. You are a nobody. A dusty ranch hand who got lucky we let him in the door. Now get out before I call the police." George smiled. It was a terrifying smile. It was the smile of a man holding 4 aces while his opponent bets the farm on a pair of 2s. "You don't know who I am?" George asked softly. "No," Julian spat. "And I don't care." George turned slightly, addressing the room, addressing the cameras, addressing the world. He took off his hat and held it over his heart for a brief second, before placing it back on his head. "My name is George Strait," he said. The silence that followed lasted only a second, but it felt like an eternity. Then a murmur rippled through the room like a wave. The bankers stood up. The older couple dropped their forks. The waiters in the back covered their mouths. "George Strait?" Julian blinked. The name sounded familiar. His parents listened to country, but he couldn't connect the dots. The man in front of him was just dusty. I've lived in Texas my whole life. George continued, his voice gaining strength, filling the room without shouting. And I've never seen a display of disrespect as ugly as what I saw here today. You fired a woman, a widow, a hard worker, because she showed kindness to a stranger. You stripped her of her dignity to impress a bunch of kids who won't remember your name tomorrow. He slammed the stack of cash onto the table next to the champagne bucket. The sound was like a gavel striking a block. "There's $5,000 there," George said, pointing a callous finger at the money. "That is for Norma. That is the tip she deserves. But I'm not leaving it with you because I don't trust you as far as I could throw a bull." George turned to the camera the girl was holding. He looked directly into the lens, breaking the fourth wall, connecting with millions of viewers instantly. "If anyone watching this knows Norma, if you know where she lives, tell her George is looking for her. And tell the owners of the Verde Horizon that until this boy is gone and Norma is treated right, I'm telling every person in Texas to stay the hell away from this place." Julian was trembling now. He saw the phones. He saw the recognition in the eyes of the other diners. He realized with a sickening lurch that he had just made a mistake that would end his career. But his arrogance wouldn't let him fold. Not yet. You can't do this," Julian stammered. "This is private property. You can't just buy people off." "I'm not buying anything," George said, turning his back on Julian. "I'm paying for what matters, integrity. Something you're bankrupt in." George began to walk toward the exit. The room parted for him like the Red Sea. People were standing up now, not out of fear, but out of respect. A man in a business suit clapped once, then stopped, but the sentiment was there. As George reached the door, he stopped and looked back at the terrified kitchen staff peeking through the window. "And the catfish was excellent," he called out to the chef. "A shame I couldn't finish it." He pushed the doors open and stepped out into the heat, leaving the air-conditioned nightmare behind. Outside, the heat hit him again, but it felt cleaner now. He scanned the parking lot. He scanned the sidewalk. He saw the empty space where a car might be, but no Norma. He looked down the road. About 200 yards away, he saw a small figure sitting on a bench, shoulders hunched. The bus hadn't come yet. George didn't get into his truck. He walked. He walked down the manicured driveway of the club, past the fountains and the flower beds, onto the public road. The dust from the passing cars kicked up around him, but he didn't care. He approached the bus stop. Norma didn't look up as he approached. She was lost in her calculations. "If I sell the wedding ring, I can get maybe 200. If I skip meals for a week." "Norma," George said gently. She jumped, clutching her purse. She looked up and saw the man from table 4, the dusty cowboy. But he looked different now. He looked taller, stronger. "Sir," she whispered, wiping her eyes hastily, "you shouldn't be out here. It's too hot. Did you get your bill sorted?" George sat down on the bench next to her. He didn't mind the heat. He didn't mind the dirt. "I didn't pay the bill," George said, "and I didn't finish the tea. But I think we have some business to discuss." Norma looked confused. "Business? I don't have a job, sir. I can't help you. I'm just waiting for the number 12 bus to take me home." George reached into his pocket and pulled out the thick roll of bills he had shown inside. He took Norma's hand. Her hand was rough, dry skin against dry skin. He pressed the money into her palm. "This isn't charity." "Norma," George said, his voice thick with emotion. "This is a retainer." A retainer?" She looked at the money. It was more than she had made in the last 6 months. Her eyes widened in shock. "Sir, I can't take this." "Who are you?" George smiled, that crooked, famous smile. "I'm just a singer who appreciates good service," he said. "But I'm also a man who needs a manager. You see, I own a few places, ranches, a little dance hall down south, and I'm tired of people running them who don't know the meaning of respect. I need someone who knows how to treat people, someone who knows that a glass of water is more important than a bottle of champagne." Norma stared at him. The cars whizzed by, the sun beat down, but she felt a coolness wash over her, a sense of peace she hadn't felt since her husband died. "Are you offering me a job?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "I'm offering you a career," George corrected. "But first I need you to do me a favor." "Anything," she said. "I need you to come back inside with me," George said, standing up and offering her his hand. "There are some people in there who need to apologize, and I don't think they're going to do it unless you're standing there to hear it." Norma looked at the Verde horizon in the distance. It was a fortress of pain for her, but looking at George, looking at the strength in his eyes, she felt a spark of courage. She took his hand. "Okay," she said, "I'm ready." Inside the club, the chaos was just beginning. The video had been posted. It had been online for 3 minutes. It already had 50,000 views. The comments were exploding. "And justice for Norma" was trending in Austin. Julian was in the corner, frantically calling the owner of the club, but no one was answering. The influencers were still filming, analyzing the drama like sportscasters. Suddenly, the doors opened again. The light from outside flooded the lobby. George Strait walked in, and holding his arm held high, limping slightly, but moving with a newfound grace, was Norma. The king had returned, and he had brought the queen with him. The silence that greeted George and Norma as they re-entered the Verde horizon was heavy, heavier than the humid air outside. It was the kind of silence that precedes a tornado, where the pressure drops and the birds stop singing. Every pair of eyes in the dining room was fixed on them. The bankers had abandoned their spreadsheets. The couples had forgotten their wine. Even the kitchen staff had pushed open the swinging doors, peering out with wide, hopeful eyes, their aprons stained with the day's labor, watching their champion return. Julian stood by the hostess stand, his phone pressed to his ear, his face a mask of pale, sweating terror. He was listening to someone screaming on the other end of the line. The live stream from the girl with the pink hair had not just stayed local. It had been shared by country music blogs, by local news stations, and by fan pages dedicated to the king. The view count was climbing into the hundreds of thousands. The comments were a scrolling wall of fire emojis and demands for justice. Julian lowered the phone slowly, his hand shaking. The call had ended. The owner of the Verde horizon, a man who rarely visited but cared deeply about his bottom line, had just delivered a message that required no interpretation. George stopped in the center of the room. He didn't shout. He didn't need to. He simply stood there, a pillar of calm integrity in a room built on anxious pretension. He still held Norma's hand, offering her his strength until she could find her own. He looked at Julian. "I believe," George said, his voice carrying effortlessly to the back corners of the room, "that you have something to say to this lady." Julian swallowed hard. His Adam's apple bobbed in his throat. He looked at the influencers who were now standing on their chairs to get a better angle. He looked at the wealthy members who were looking at him with disgust, distancing themselves from his cruelty. He had no allies left. The facade of the powerful manager had crumbled, revealing the insecure bully beneath. "Hi," Julian started, his voice cracking. He cleared his throat, trying to summon some shred of dignity. "Norma, I may have been hasty. The stress of the VIP arrival, it caused a lapse in judgment." George didn't move. "That's an excuse, son, not an apology. Try again and look her in the eye when you say it." Norma squeezed George's hand, then she let go. She took a step forward. She stood on her aching leg, but she stood tall. She looked at the young man who had tormented her for months, the man who had made her feel small and invisible. She didn't see a monster anymore. She saw a boy who had lost his way. Julian looked down at his Italian shoes, then forced himself to look up into Norma's tired, kind face. "I am sorry, Norma," he whispered. "I was wrong to fire you. I was wrong to speak to you that way." Norma nodded slowly. Her expression was not one of triumph, but of grace. "I forgive you, Mr. Julian," she said softly, "not because you deserve it, but because I don't have room in my heart to carry your hate. I have enough heavy things to carry." The room let out a collective breath. It was a moment of pure, unadulterated class, the kind of class you can't learn in a business school. George stepped forward again. "That's good," he said. "Now, there's one more thing. The owner of this establishment, Mr. Sterling, he and I go way back. We used to hunt together in South Texas. I gave him a call while I was outside." Julian's eyes widened. You know Mr. Sterling?" George nodded. "I do." And he was very interested to hear how his new manager treats the staff. He was watching the video, Julian. He saw you snap your fingers. He saw you grab her apron. He didn't like it much. George reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone, which he had been using earlier. He tapped the screen and held it up. A voice boomed from the speakerphone, loud and angry. "Julian, put your keys on the counter. You are relieved of duty effective immediately. Get out of my club." The words hung in the air like smoke. Julian looked around, desperate for someone to object, but the room was against him. The chef, a burly man who had been listening from the kitchen door, walked out. He wasn't smiling, but there was a grim satisfaction on his face. He walked up to the hostess stand, picked up the keys Julian had placed there earlier, and crossed his arms. "Kitchen is closed for you, Julian," the chef said. Julian looked at the cameras, at George, and finally at Norma. He realized he was completely alone. He turned and walked toward the door, his head down, stripped of his power, stripped of his pride. As he pushed through the glass doors into the heat, no one said a word. He just vanished into the bright light of the afternoon, a cautionary tale in a designer suit. The atmosphere in the room shifted instantly. It was as if a window had been opened and fresh air had rushed in. The influencers started clapping, then the bankers, then the whole room. They were clapping for Norma. George turned to her. "Well, Norma, it looks like your position here is open again. Mr. Sterling told me to tell you that if you want it, you can be the floor manager. Double the pay, full benefits. You run the place how you see fit." Norma looked around the restaurant. She looked at the tables she had cleaned, the floors she had swept. She looked at the faces of her co-workers who were beaming at her. It was a tempting offer. It was security. It was vindication. But then she looked at George. She remembered the way he had defended her. She remembered the offer he had made at the bus stop. She realized that staying here, even as a manager, would always remind her of the pain. She was ready for a new chapter. She looked up at George and smiled, a real radiant smile that took 10 years off her face. "Mr. Sterling is a kind man," she said, "but I think I've served my last plate at the Verdi Horizon. I accepted a job offer at a bus stop about 10 minutes ago, and I'm a woman of my word." George grinned, tipping his hat back. "I was hoping you'd say that." He turned to the room, to the cameras that were still rolling. "Folks, enjoy your lunch, and remember, be good to each other. It doesn't cost a dime." With that, George Strait placed a hand on Norma's back and guided her toward the exit. They walked out together, the Cowboy King and the waitress, leaving behind a room that would never be the same. 6 months later. The Texas hill country was painted in shades of burnt orange and gold as autumn settled over the land. The air was crisp, smelling of cedar and wood smoke. Down a winding gravel road, past a gate adorned with a simple iron rose, sat the Dusty Rose Dance Hall. It wasn't a fancy place. It was a historic building restored with love, with wide porches and a tin roof that sang when it rained. Inside, the place was bustling. It wasn't a country club. It was a home. Families were eating barbecue at long picnic tables. Couples were spinning on the dance floor to a live fiddle band. The atmosphere was warm, welcoming, and filled with laughter. In the center of it all moved Norma. She wasn't wearing a polyester uniform anymore. She was wearing a crisp denim shirt, a nice pair of boots that fit her perfectly, and a silver badge that read General Manager. She didn't limp as much these days. The new health insurance had covered the physical therapy she had needed for years. She moved through the crowd not as a servant, but as a host. She knew everyone's name. She asked about their babies, their cattle, their lives. She walked over to a table near the stage, where a young waitress dropped a tray of drinks. The girl looked terrified, waiting to be yelled at. Norma knelt down immediately, not to scold, but to help. "It's all right, darling," Norma said soothingly, picking up the glass shards. "It's just glass, we have plenty more. Go get a mop and watch your fingers." The girl smiled, relief washing over her. "Thank you, Miss Norma." Norma stood up and wiped her hands. She looked toward the back of the hall near the bar. George Strait was leaning against a wooden pillar, nursing a Dr. Pepper. He wasn't performing tonight. He was just checking in. He wore his hat low, but his eyes were smiling as he watched Norma work. He walked over to her, the crowd parting respectfully. They knew him here, but they let him be. Here, he was just the owner. Place looks good, Norma, George said, looking around at the happy crowd. Receipts are up 20% from last month. Norma laughed, tucking a strand of grey hair behind her ear. It's the cobbler, George. I told you, if we used my grandmother's recipe, they'd come from 3 counties over. It's not the cobbler, George said softly. It's the heart. You put a heart back in this place. It was just a building before you got here. Now it's a sanctuary. Norma blushed, looking down at her boots. I'm just treating people the way they ought to be treated. That's all it takes, George said. He looked toward the door. A man had just walked in. He was wearing a delivery uniform, carrying a crate of sodas. He looked tired, older than his years. It was Julian. After the video went viral, Julian had become unemployable in the luxury hospitality sector in Texas. His name was Mud. He had lost his condo, his car, and his ego. He was now driving a delivery truck for a local distributor, working long hours, lifting heavy boxes. He saw Norma across the room. He froze. He hadn't seen her since that day. He hesitated, looking like he wanted to turn and run. Norma saw him. She didn't look away. She excused herself from George and walked over to the delivery entrance. Julian braced himself, expecting a snide remark, expecting her to kick him out. "Hello, Julian," Norma said. Julian lowered the crate, wiping sweat from his forehead. "Hello, Norma. I have the delivery for the bar." "You look thirsty," Norma said. "I'm okay," Julian mumbled, unable to meet her eyes. Norma shook her head. "Nonsense. It's a long drive from the warehouse." She turned to the bar. "Hey, Jimmy, get this man a large iced tea and put a slice of lemon in it." She turned back to Julian. "On the house. You take a break before you head back, you hear?" Julian looked at her, his eyes filling with sudden tears. He had expected vengeance. He received mercy. "Thank you, Norma," he choked out. "You're welcome," Norma said. "Work hard, Julian. It's good for the soul." She walked back to George, who had watched the whole exchange. He didn't say anything, but he tipped his hat to her. It was the highest compliment he could give. The band started playing a slow song. The fiddle cried out a sweet, mournful melody that turned into a waltz. George set his drink down. "Well, Madam Manager," George said, extending his hand, "I believe the boss is allowed to ask the staff for a dance." Norma giggled. "I sound like a girl of 16. I suppose it's in the employee handbook somewhere." She took his hand. George Strait led Norma onto the sawdust-covered floor. The crowd cheered as they saw them. They weren't cheering for a celebrity. They were cheering for a story of redemption, of justice, and of the simple, unbreakable power of kindness. As they spun slowly under the warm lights of the dance hall, Norma rested her head for a moment on the shoulder of the man who had saved her life. But George knew the truth. He hadn't saved her. He had just reminded the world that she was worth saving. Outside, the Texas stars shone bright and clear, looking down on the dusty rows, a place where the tea was always cold, the music was always real, and everyone, no matter who they were, had a seat at the table. George spun her one last time as the song faded. He leaned in and whispered, "You were right about the cobbler, though." Norma laughed, and the sound echoed into the night, a victory song sweeter than any melody ever written.